I want to officially welcome you to our Global Cares Day, very important day here at LexisNexis. Today we have 29,000 people across all of RELX Group, including 10,000 people at Legal and Professional participating in events all around the globe. Everybody's encouraged to participate in the CARES activity in their local communities to support their local communities, whether that's at their desk or out in the field. And it's just, it's great to see that kind of energy and commitment. And as we've talked about, it's our one day to move the world, and it's an exciting thing to see. For me, I'm just very happy to shine a spotlight here on advancing the rule of law. You know, we've talked about this before, but according to the United Nations, there are 4 billion people across the globe who do not enjoy the umbrella protection of the rule of law. And for these people, the daily struggle for human rights is it's not an abstract concept. It's a matter of basic daily survival. And so for us, our mission at LexisNexis is to extend that rule of law umbrella protection as far and wide as we can across the globe, and ultimately bring those 4 billion people who do not have that protection down to zero. And we do that every day in partnership with our customers, in the way we roll out our products, the way we extend our position in countries like Africa, for example, where we're the largest publisher of laws. And the key dimension of that is really the partnership with our customers. And we have many customers of ours here today, and we want to thank you for that commitment and working together in that very important mission. We also work with the United Nations, and many of you are aware of the initiative that we've launched to extend business for rule of law across the globe, and we do that in consultation with our partners from the UN Global Compact. And I see we have many of them here with us today, so I want to thank you all for attending as well. In just a minute, I'm going to introduce Sarah Iqbal from the World Bank, who is going to present her findings from Women and Business and the Law 2016 report. And ensuring gender equality is a key part of extending rule of law protection. And I'm looking forward to hearing Sarah's remarks because I think we can make some real progress in this area. But before I do that, I want to recognize our 79 Global Cares champions across the globe for their exceptional work really throughout the year, and in particular to support these efforts. Last year, under their stewardship and thanks to your hard work and commitment, we ended up, our 10,000 people at Legal and Professional ended up devoting 40,000 hours to CARES. And this year, of course, we're hoping to top that. So without further delay, I want to welcome Sarah Iqbal from the World Bank. We first started talking about ways to raise awareness for women, business, and the law report during our Business for the Rule of Law consultation in Washington, D.C. Earlier this year. And I think when you read the report, you'll find the results of it fairly sobering. I know I did. Very simply, many of the rules, regulations, and policies that continue to prevent women from improving their own positions are existent throughout the world. And I was actually surprised when you see the report on legal gender equality that the results on where the U.S. ranks globally is not as good as one might have expected. So Sarah's going to take you through the findings, and she's going to take you through a call to action, and she's going to give a little Q&A at the end. Please welcome Sarah Iqbal to the stage. Sarah, come on up.
Thank you so much, Mike, and I especially want to thank Stephanie and Teresa as well for having me here. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to come here and speak at CARES Day. I've been researching a little bit about what you do at LexisNexis in terms of giving back to the community, and I really feel like in terms of corporate social responsibility, not every private sector firm does what you do, so it's a privilege for me, and I'm sure everyone in this room feels very lucky to work for LexisNexis. I want to talk a little bit about the work that we do at the World Bank with the Women, Business, and the Law Project, and really why it matters for the rule of law, why it matters for the things that you care about as legal professionals and professionals in the legal community, and also why legal data matters. Because really at the World Bank, what we do is we're data people. We focus on the data environment. I may have a lot of education in the legal field, but I'm surrounded by PhD economists. Everyone that I work with is a PhD economist, and they have a lot more education than I do. And it's kind of interesting to see why the legal environment actually matters for macroeconomic outcomes. So I want to give you a little bit of history about where this research started from and why it is that we do what we do. So the World Bank produces a report called Doing Business that's been around for about 12 years now, and it looks at the legal environment for entrepreneurs. And in 2007, our board came to us and said, well, this is great, this research that you're doing on the business environment. What about women? How do these laws affect women? Is it harder or easier for women to do business? And at the time, we didn't know. We had no idea how this mattered for women, why it mattered for women, and even if it did matter for women. And so we took a look through our survey collection mechanism to try and find out where there are laws that constrain women. And what we realized is we didn't know what we were talking about, and really we were looking at the wrong things. So we were looking at business startup law, we were looking at bankruptcy, we were looking at employment. And what we realized, talking to lawyers in these countries, finding out what really matters for women is actually we should have been looking at family law, we should have been looking at property law, we should have been looking at things like maternity leave, retirement ages for women. So we took a step back and we realized, okay, if we're going to do this, we should do this properly and really measure the legal environment for women to see where the constraints are. So we started a new survey data collection mechanism and started building out the Women, Business, and the Law database. And this we see as really an ancillary product to doing business, focusing specifically on gender constraints for women. So we started measuring 128 countries. Now we're up to 173 countries, and we really kind of look at why this matters. So what does the research tell us? Well, in 2007, 2008, this research really didn't exist. This is basically research that's been developed over the last 8 years through the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and others. And essentially, there's now a strong body of research telling us, well, yes, in fact, you are measuring the right things, and these things have a strong effect on GDP growth. So for example, gender legal differences significantly decrease female labor force participation and undermine GDP growth. Well, what does that mean? Basically, if you say women can't work in certain jobs, women don't work in those jobs. It's a very simple association, and that actually undermines overall growth for the economy because you're cutting out 50% of your population. And legal gender equality, so better laws for women, is associated with lower gender gaps in women's labor force participation without significantly affecting male participation rates. And the reason that that matters is we go into countries and we tell them you should actually adjust these laws so more women can work, and they say, well, if more women work, then men won't get those jobs. That's the number one argument, and actually that's not true. That's not borne out by the research. Where more women work, where more women start businesses, they actually increase the size of the economic pie. So everyone has more jobs. It's not that women are taking away jobs from men. And gender gaps in women's entrepreneurship and labor force participation account for estimated income losses that are actually really big. So 27% in the Middle East and North Africa, 19% in South Asia, 14% in Latin America, 10% in Europe. So basically this is income that you could have if you didn't have these gender gaps, if women were working at the same levels as men, if they were pursuing entrepreneurship activities. And so the research is actually very emerging in this area, and we see this as a new field for rule of law issues. And there are a lot of country-level impact evaluations, and what I mean by that is, what does the evidence tell us? So basically, there's research on what impact reforming the law actually has on women's sort of labor force participation and other things. So in Ethiopia, for example, they reformed the family law. In the family law, it used to say husbands could stop their wives from working if they felt it was not in the interest of the family. They eliminated that. They provided for joint titling, and there was sort of econometric research telling us, well, actually, where this happened in Ethiopia, women were more likely to work outside the home in higher value-added jobs. They were more likely to work full-time. There was an impact evaluation also done in India. They reformed the Hindu Succession Act. Basically, what they did was they reformed how women could inherit joint family property. They couldn't before, now they can, and we've measured the effects, and the effects of this are actually quite stark. So women, mothers who benefited from the reform spent twice as much on their daughters' education. They were more likely to have bank accounts. Their households were more likely to have sanitary latrines in the home, and that's actually really important for girls' hygiene, but also for protecting women against violence. Because if you don't have a latrine in the home, you go out into the fields, you go at 5:30 in the morning, and that's where women and girls suffer from violence. So these effects are actually quite interesting. And what we find is a trend in the literature. So basically, it has to do with when women were granted voting rights. So we see similar effects in the United States when they granted women voting rights at the state level about 100 years ago. We started seeing differences in what legislators actually provided for. So it's not like women could be in the state legislature, but they could vote out people they didn't like. And essentially we saw increases in public health spending, greater public hygiene campaigns, and a decrease in childhood mortality because they were putting more money into telling people they needed to wash their hands and do other things. So it's about preferences. It's not that women are better than men, but it's basically women's preferences are not reflected, and you want greater, well, some people are laughing, but my perspective is that you want greater diversity in perspective, right? So maybe women have a different perspective than men, and if that perspective is not at the table, then they're essentially cut out and those voices are not being listened to. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the data is collected, and please bear with me because this actually will be important at the end of the presentation. So we go through a 2-year process of data collection, and all of the data that we produce in this really thick book that I didn't hand out, mainly because it's really heavy, it's like a phone book, but it has data for 173 countries, and we get this data from lawyers in these 173 countries. So what we do is we consult with gender experts, people from the private sector, civil society, UN organizations, and we ask them, what do you think matters for gender equality? You know, this is the data that we collect. Should we do more? For example, should we look at childcare? Should we look at financial inclusion? And so we collect all this information and we develop surveys. And these surveys go out to legal professionals in 173 economies. These are lawyers in the private sector. These are judges. These are sort of professors at law schools. Sometimes they get their students in clinics to fill out the surveys. We talk to public officials, and we send out these surveys. We have a massive database and a big IT operation to send out these surveys. We send them out in Arabic. We send them out in Russian, Chinese, English, French, Spanish. We get the information back, and we have a team that codes this data. So basically the team is trained in comparative law and they make it comparable. We analyze the relevant laws and regulations. We produce this report. We consult across the World Bank Group on this report that you have the main findings of. We sent it out for review to about 700 people in the World Bank, and they all came back and they gave us comments on the data. They gave us comments on the report, and then we publish, and that's disseminated. We actually published last week. So the idea is to raise awareness on why gender equal laws actually matter, why they matter for economic growth, why countries should reform, and what the effect is of that reform. So it's kind of highlighting this area of research. And how are the data verified? Again, we try and be as transparent as possible, and one of the components of good rule of law is transparency. So we want to put this information out in a way that's publicly accessible. We sort of provide the information of all of our contributors that are willing to be acknowledged. So here you see the contributors from Brazil. These are the people that provided the data from Brazil. We always link back to the law in the original language if we can, and we provide the information at the data point level. So if if we say, for example, there's a job restriction in Russia, and there is, by the way, in Russia, there are 456 specific jobs women cannot do because they are women, we link back to that law. The idea is that people in Russia should then talk to their government, the World Bank talks to their government, others talk to the government to reform this. And so we want to make the information as accessible and easy to digest as possible. We have 7 indicators that we collect this information under. Accessing institutions looks at basic legal capacity issues. So can I, as a woman, sign a contract in the same way as a man? Sort of using property looks at women's ability to own, administer, leverage, and inherit property. Getting a job looks at job restrictions on women's work. It looks at gender differentiated retirement ages and maternity, paternity, and parental leave regimes. Providing incentives to work looks at taxation and education. Are there tax credits and deductions, for example, for childcare, which is very important for women's work? Building credit and going to court actually look at processes that can help small business owners, many of whom are likely to be women, and women-owned businesses are much more likely to be smaller, they're likely to be informal, and they're likely to be home-based. And the newest indicator that we have is protecting women from violence, which looks at things like domestic violence law, sexual harassment, what are the laws on marital rape. There are some countries, for example, where you can rape someone and marry them, and that's a legal defense. Well, this is something that we highlight and put a spotlight on to encourage governments to reform this. So what do the data tell us? Well, the data tell us that 90% of economies covered have at least one law impeding women's economic opportunities. And that's across the globe, developing and developed economies. And I do want to highlight this because we measure this every 2 years, so we update the data set. And we had the same finding 2 years ago. And we increased the size of the data set by 20%. We added 30 economies this time, and I thought for sure this is going to change. This finding will not hold. And actually it held at exactly the same level. So quite frankly, what this shows us is it's pervasive, these laws impeding women's ability to participate in the workplace. They're across the board. And really sort of, why does it matter? So basically, it's associated with a host of economic outcomes. So lower legal gender equality is associated with fewer girls attending secondary schools, fewer women working or running businesses, and a wider gender wage gap. So basically it matters. It matters for girls' schooling, it matters for women's ownership of businesses, it matters for women's employment, and it matters for the gender wage gap. So these are very robust findings, and we find them there are a lot of associations in other areas as well that I'll go into. But this is interesting. In 100 economies, women are restricted from doing the same jobs as men. This is an illustrative list. So for example, I mentioned the Russian Federation. Women can't be truck drivers in agriculture. They can't be freight train conductors. They can't be plumbers. There are all sorts of specific jobs that they can't do. And it's a very, very long list. And basically, it's not pregnant women, it's not nursing mothers, it's just normal women who can't do these jobs because they are women. Another one I want to point out is in France. Women can't carry loads greater than 25 kilograms. Why does that matter? What difference does that even make? Well, women can't be working at the post office. They can't be FedEx drivers. They can't be UPS drivers because they can't lift these packages. And you may think, well, what is that weight threshold? Well, that's the average weight of a 5-year-old child. I mean, to me, if that's your perspective, maybe you should increase the weight limits or look at it from a woman's perspective, because every mother I know will pick up her kid and carry him from A to B. And it matters. It matters actually for sort of women's earning potential. So it's not so much that I as a woman earn less than a man for the same job. We talk about the gender wage gap. One of the main drivers of the gender wage gap is actually occupational segregation. And what that means is women are sorted into lower value added jobs, jobs that pay less than the jobs that men get. And actually restrictions on women's work decreases women's earning potential relative to men. So where there's at least one job restriction, women are likely to earn even less than they would. And everyone knows there's a gender wage gap in every country in the world, including this one. So another thing that we look at is domestic violence. 46 economies out of the 173 that we cover have no laws on domestic violence. And you'll see this is a regional breakdown. Actually, the region with the least laws, or rather the fewest laws on domestic violence, is the Middle East and North Africa. Only 4 economies that we cover have laws on domestic violence. And this is not implementation of these laws. I want to caution you, you'll see in South Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean, they actually have very comprehensive laws on domestic violence. But that doesn't mean that the laws are implemented well. It doesn't mean that they change social and behavioral norms. It doesn't mean in these regions there is no domestic violence. It just means that they've taken a first step in terms of trying to acknowledge there's a problem and hopefully towards reducing it. But it is a long way forward in terms of implementing the laws and also changing behaviors to reduce domestic violence. Well, why does it even matter to have a domestic violence law? Actually, it matters quite a bit. Women's life expectancy is likely to be higher where they're legally protected from domestic violence. And actually, 1/3 of murders of women are conducted by an intimate partner. Women are more likely to be murdered by their husband or an intimate partner than a stranger. So it does matter quite a bit. And I don't want to say it's all bad news. I actually don't believe that. I think we've done a lot in terms of moving towards legal gender equality, and what governments do, what laws and policies they put in place really do help women pursue entrepreneurial activities and gain jobs. So I think laws matter, the legal environment matters, and what governments can do really does help women. So women are more likely to receive wages from an employer where governments support childcare. And that's either publicly provided childcare or childcare subsidized by the government. And it matters because women are the primary caregivers for children, and if you provide options for them to take care of their children, it actually is much more likely that they will be employed in the formal sector. So another thing that we found really interesting is we started measuring this recently. It's non-discrimination laws and access to credit on the basis of gender. Globally, 46 economies have this law, and actually what's really interesting about it is how it started, the countries that have it. South Africa is the only economy in sub-Saharan Africa that has such a law, and actually the United States was a leader in this. In the early 70s, they introduced the Equal Opportunity and Access to Credit law, and at first it didn't have women included in it. And there was a congresswoman actually who thought, well, this must be a mistake. Let me just include gender and marital status because you must have forgotten to include them. And so she put it in, and what's even more interesting is she was only in Congress because her husband used to be in Congress and he passed away and she was elected to his seat. And she introduced this, and I think marital status is even more important than gender in this regard, because it used to be the case that married women in the United States couldn't have a credit history in their own name. It was tied up to their husbands. And if he divorced them, if he died, they were left with no credit history and no ability to leverage that. So these are hugely important laws. Another thing I want to point out is parental leave. So about a third of economies provide parental leave, and parental leave regimes can really increase women's participation in the workforce. 167 out of 173 economies mandate maternity leave, paid or unpaid, or parental leave, sort of is by a third of economies. One thing I do want to point out is the United States is one of 4 economies that doesn't have paid maternity or paid parental leave, and the other 3 are Suriname, Papua New Guinea, and Tonga. So, it's a question, do we really want to be in that club? I would assume that we don't, and I would hope that one day we would provide paid leave. And it's actually interesting, I saw in the papers recently, the Obama administration introduced flex time for sort of government employees. Why that's important, sort of paid leave flex time, is mothers actually are more likely to take it to care for their kids when they're sick than for themselves. They'll come to work sick, but if their child is sick, they need the time to take off. And who pays for maternity leave also matters. So maternity leave affects the cost of hiring workers and of hiring women relative to men. When the government pays for it or pays part of it, this cost is mitigated. So if I, as an employer, have to pay the full cost of maternity leave, I'm just less likely to hire women. I won't do it because it doesn't make sense for me financially. But if government can help take care of that, I think it's quite helpful for the employer. Approximately 50% of economies that provide paid leave, the government pays for maternity benefits, and a further 19% of economies that the government and employers share the payments. And I'll direct you towards South Asia. Most economies in South Asia obligate the employer to pay 100% of maternity leave. Well, who's going to do that? And the other thing I want to point out is domestic violence legislation. This is actually a really important time for gender in the international arena. It's the 20-year anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, where governments from around the world committed to a host of things that they would do to improve gender equality. It's the start of the Sustainable Development Framework. Sort of in the next couple of weeks, governments at the UN will decide what the targets are, what the indicators are for the SDG framework, and they have a goal on gender equality, Goal 5, on women's economic empowerment. Well, I focus on international law, and often people will say to me, does it even matter? Do these commitments matter? And I would say they do matter. And this graph really brought it home for me. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there were almost no governments on earth who had laws on domestic violence. So there were about 9 laws in place. Now there are 127. And you can see where the trends are. So basically, after international commitments, after the Beijing Platform for Action, governments started introducing domestic violence laws. So you see, for example, the Belém de Pará Convention. That's a convention in Latin America. When they passed that, countries throughout Latin America started introducing domestic violence laws. You'll see the Maputo Protocol. Once they passed that in Sub-Saharan Africa, countries throughout Sub-Saharan Africa started introducing domestic violence laws. And the reason it's so stark to me is basically this is in my lifetime that countries have started introducing laws on domestic violence. And it's not that domestic violence didn't exist before, it's just that nobody paid attention to it. And I think it's incredibly important that there is a spotlight on this issue, that governments are working towards improving the environment for women, and really that they're acknowledging it. So you see over the past 2 years, 65 economies carried out 94 reforms, increasing women's economic opportunities. And the trend that we see, and we've measured this over the last 50 years, we've measured this going back in time for domestic violence over the last 20 years, and we've been measuring this systematically every 2 years, sort of in the areas that we look at. And the trend is overwhelmingly positive. Most governments move in the direction of reforming. Maybe they don't do it at the pace that we would like, they're not as fast as we would like, but they do it according to their own country context in the ways that they want. And they're really improving laws for women in a variety of areas. So I do see this as overall positive. And most reforms took place in developing economies. So in Europe and Central Asia, 19 reforms occurred. In Sub-Saharan Africa, there were 18 reforms. And I want to give you some examples. Mexico has a new law making payments for child care tax deductible. India is the first developing economy that has a quota for women on corporate boards. Mozambique enacted a new penal code, as I mentioned, where basically marriage is no longer a defense for rape. That's huge. And by the way, there are a lot of countries that still have that law in place. So a lot of these reforms are happening, and I think what we can do is encourage economies to really do these reforms, to carry out these reforms, to implement these reforms. And so I was asked to speak about what LexisNexis can do to help. And really what I think you can do to help is in 2 main areas. One is spreading the word about why this matters in the work that you do, because your contact with legal professionals is far greater than the banks. You talk to them every day through law schools, through law firms, through your work with governments in improving the rule of law framework. What we do is collect this data on a pro bono basis. So if you recall my slide at the beginning with the circular chart, basically we ask lawyers, we ask law firms, we ask law professors, can you please fill out these surveys? Can you tell us what the laws are in your country that affect women? And we spend a lot of time emailing them, talking to them on the phone, telling them the importance of this work, and really asking them for their help and finding out the information on the ground, because they know it far, far better than we do. And what we'd like is to develop a partnership with you and really leverage your work with these people to get better information, because we see this as a data base that's a global public good. This data is for everyone. It's for the private sector. It's for civil society organizations. It's for governments. It's for the IMF. It's for activists in their communities to really understand what the impediments are. And also, we'd like you to really help build awareness on why these impediments matter, why they matter for women, but why they matter for women's families, why they matter for communities, why they matter for societies, and encourage governments to really reform these laws. And when you engage, for example, I know you work with Myanmar to develop a better rule of law framework as they sort of increase the robustness of their legal system. Well, Myanmar is a country that has no law on domestic violence. This is something that would be really important for them. And the other thing that I would say is you sit at a unique position in terms of being a private sector company with a strong commitment to improving the rule of law and establishing networks of legal professionals around the world. And really, you work on human trafficking, you work on sort of providing information on rule of law through your resource center. And I would ask, really embed women's issues within the larger framework. I don't believe that women's issues should be a standalone issue. It shouldn't be something that we talk about from here. It should really be embedded into everything we do as part of the larger rule of law framework, as part of these discussions. When we talk about incorporating this work in projects that the World Bank does, we don't say, well, hey, you should have a separate project on women's economic empowerment. Rather, we say you have this conversation going with the government of Cote d'Ivoire on how to improve the entrepreneurship framework. Why don't you take a look at your family law and remove this restriction that husbands can stop their wives from working? And that's how we carry projects forward. So it's part of a whole, but it's not something that stands over here. Oftentimes, I think women's issues get short shrift because we think of them as something apart from the framework of what we do. I don't think that's the case. And I would really ask that you take a look at it from a broader perspective. And finally, all of the information that I'm talking about is available on our website, wbl.worldbank.org. I would encourage you to look at it, ask your partners, your clients, and others to look at it, and tell us how we can improve, what we should be covering, what would be useful for you in your work, because we really do want to make this a collaborative effort. And by no means do we presume that we know everything. I think we know a very small piece of what it is that we need to know, and we see this as a continuing effort. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Very good. Let's give Sarah a huge thank you for spending time with us. Yes.
Thank you.
Well done. Well done. And as I mentioned, she's going to hang out with us for a little bit, so anybody who's got further questions, please feel free to come on up, mingle, chat, and good luck on all your CARES events today. Great to see all the red shirts out there. Thanks.
Okay.